Okay, welcome to KB chapters 1 through 6. I'm just going to do one video that's going to hit the highlights. This is a very brief flyby of these first 6 chapters. Most of this is background information, should be things that you already know. So let's get going. So to start out, a little bit of background. Tests are tools that we can choose to use in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they're used sort of for the greater good, sometimes they're not. But the purpose of the test should match the intended purpose of the objectives, the class, and that kind of thing. So, example, actually, I was just working on a project at home earlier today. Couldn't find the little opener for getting my can of paint open, so I grabbed a screwdriver, and because that's what was handy. And so, if I'm using a screwdriver for a screw, like to screw something in, that is what the intended purpose was. All right. But if I'm using a screwdriver to open my can of paint, that's not exactly the intended purpose. Can it work? Yes, kind of in some cases, but it's not always the best option. Some other things to kind of keep in mind. The quality of test design varies. All right. The test making ability of the person who created it is a large factor, and you will find that you get better at making tests the more you do, sort of the better you get at it. I think it takes like 2 to 3 times per test to kind of get to a point where I feel pretty good about the tests that I've created. And ideally, you should have some training when it comes to testing. Now, when you're doing standardized testing and those kinds of things, you probably will go through training. This isn't talking about just an essay exam that you create for your class, although you can kind of consider this class to be some of the training for that. Every test has limitations. It can't measure everything about every sort of population, about every circumstance or scenario. So in most cases, we're just trying to get uh, the bulk of the objectives, the bulk of the population, kind of trying to address those things. And the reliability and validity. So reliability meaning that you're going to get the same results over and over and over because you're following the same steps and protocols um, is important. Validity is important. Validity is that the test measures what it's supposed to measure. And everything has to be administered properly at the right time for the right purpose, the right population of students. There are some very specific protocols for standardized testing. And it's like certain grades of kids, usually they start first thing in the morning. It's a certain time, just like when you took the ACT. Okay. Problem is that the population of students who you're going to be teaching is becoming increasingly diverse. And a lot of the measurement, the tests that have been created, were not created with that in mind. So that creates a potential problem because of some bias. So every test also provides only just a snapshot. It's where that student is at that specific time. It doesn't tell us where the student was a week ago. It doesn't tell us where they could be. It doesn't tell us um, a whole lot about anything except what they knew on that day at that time. And so you have to kind of be a little bit sensitive to the fact that, if you have a one shot to do something well, you may or may not get the kind of response from your students that you were hoping for. And that means that these interpretations should be sensitive to all these different factors. You could have a really great student who has an off day, a really great student who has something going on who didn't prepare right, or they prepared for the wrong sorts of information. And so being sensitive to those factors is really important. So the difference between tests and assessments is something that this class is going to talk a lot about, but you can kind of see here a lot of the bullets on the left versus the right. But typically, a test is just a one and done. It's a one-time thing, a one-time sort of measuring tool that I would provide to students. It's like taking, a snapshot, a picture with your phone. Okay. Whereas an assessment should be something that takes place over a period of time, almost like taking a video on your phone versus taking a picture. So the video is going to tell us what happened a little bit before that specific image, what happened after that image. It's going to give us a little bit more context, and those kinds of things. So In those cases, the assessment provides more information. It's usually a little bit better in terms of helping you evaluate where a student stands. Tests are usually used for creating grades and making decisions about curriculum instruction. How are the students doing? Are the students understanding? Do I need to slow down my pace of material? Do I need to speed up my pace of material? But it's a picture in live time. Okay. Whereas the assessment tells us a little bit about the quality of instruction, if we need to revise the curriculum, same as a test, but maybe a little bit more because it gives us more than just that snapshot, and it's a more thorough accounting of the situation. Okay. Assessments can be formative, meaning like in the moment. They could be interim, like halfway through a unit or halfway through a semester, or they could be summative, meaning at the end, kind of summing up all the information. Different types of tests and assessments. We're going to talk about how to create these later in the class, but the ones that this chapter specifically addresses are objective essay, performance, portfolio. So like objective tests, very high consistency. This is typical multiple choice, true, false, matching, etc. Most of the kinds of things that you probably had throughout college. Essay tests, they are a great way to see if students really are fully understanding the information, but it also means that there needs to be a very specific rubric so that you can be objective when you're doing your grading. If you want students to get to like to say specific things in their responses, those kinds of things need to be on the rubric. And then performance or portfolio, y'all have done this in terms of like your senior portfolios, and you'll potentially do it again at the end of your education, your MAE. The portfolio is valuable because it gives us a snapshot from a lot of different points, a lot of data points. Talking about liberal arts, talking about different standards and those kinds of things. We're looking at not just one measure, but we're looking at sort of the body of work that you created, in this case, like as an undergrad. Teacher-made tests, standardized tests, those are types of things that you're going to use in the classroom. They vary among teachers. Your school district or state that you teach in may require certain standardized tests. Those are typically developed by a team, a committee, professionals elsewhere, and then adopted by your district or by your state. Norm referenced and criterion referenced, the difference between those, norm referenced is student v. student, or you're assessed against like how your peers do. And so when you took the ACT or SAT, that was a good example of a norm reference test. When we do fitness testing, so things like sit and reach or the mile run, IQ tests, those are also norm reference because it is you're being compared against other people your age, your gender, those kinds of things. A criterion reference test pits your responses against a set standard. So when you take the content exam for your MAE discipline, you have to have a passing score, and you'll know what the cut score is for your discipline, but you have to be at or above whatever that cut score is. That is the standard. So criterion reference is like meeting the standard. Bar exam, the NCLEX for nurses, medical boards, there is also all a minimum passing score on those. Another type of tests or assessments are curriculum-based measurements, and they're historically used in special education and with RTI interventions to make decisions about a specific student or about program progress. And we're going to talk more about that in a later chapter. So I put this picture in. I just got done doing JBA for 3 weeks, and this is a little bit about how I feel after working with middle school, early high schoolers for 3 weeks straight. Teaching can be really stressful, and there's a lot of different influences that make our workplace, an easy place to go to, or sometimes a difficult place to go to. And it is the same when it comes to what happens in the classroom. Okay, the curriculum that you use likely will be a decision made by your school board or by your school district. And so you won't have too much say in that. You may have some autonomy on how you deliver that instruction, but there's a lot of different influences that we need to think about. So in the classroom, Your principal is going to have some say in that. The students, counselors, you can see parents are also a part of the equation. I think in elementary school seems to be like when parents maybe are the most involved with their children's education. But there are parents who are still pretty involved with middle school, high school aged students. So outside this, I mean, there are certain laws that govern what needs to happen in education. The state Board of Education, or in Missouri, that's a DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. That's who you'll receive your licensure through. In your school district, if you're involved in a teacher union, that will make a difference. But I just wanted you to kind of get a picture of all of the different influences. And then as a teacher, you're delivering lessons where all of these people have some amount of say. And that can be either really good or it can be really hard some days. Okay, so that was kind of chapter one in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk about some of the legislation and things that have happened that have affected education. So the big thing was COVID. And with COVID, as you can expect, there were declines in student achievement during COVID, but also post COVID. And mostly that was due to those shifts to remote and hybrid instruction. There wasn't a lot of lead up preparation to get students to a point where they knew what they were supposed to be doing when and if school shut down. I know even here at Truman, we didn't have a lot of discussion about what that was going to look like. Because when everything kind of first shut down, we thought it was a very temporary, and it ended up being a lot longer than anyone thought. My kids were in high school at the high school and college at the time, and my daughter, just like my oldest daughter, just like here at Truman, she was like fully remote. My high school kids were remote for a period of time, and then they were on a hybrid schedule where they went to school every other day. And so that was all, it was a learning curve for everyone. Okay, so obviously that affects learning when you take the continuity and consistency of like the structure of a school day. Certain, like working at home certainly has different issues than working at school. And the students who showed the most issues, decline in student achievement, are exactly who you would think. They're students in schools with very few resources, so usually high poverty schools. The government calls them Title I. So, one of the other things I think that's important to note is that during that time, teachers also reported higher levels of stress than people who were working on the front lines in healthcare. And mostly that was due to the fact that there was no training for teachers in terms of how to address what they were supposed to be doing with students who are in a remote setting. I certainly didn't go through any training for that, and it was very challenging in terms of teaching, future physical educators how to teach physical education, doing that remote, watching videos, not actually being able to be hands-on was a very difficult. And I had, so most of us were just kind of on the internet looking at other people's ideas, trying to do the best that we could, but it was super stressful at the time. Some different initiatives, I'm sure you've heard about these in some of your previous education classes. No Child Left Behind, that was passed in 2002. And it required that students meet adequate yearly progress, or AYP. The problem was that so students were able to set what they wanted their AYP to be, but once a school didn't meet that, the standard didn't change. So if they, let's say they got to like 80% of AYP, for the next year it ramped up again from the first baseline. So not only are you starting from behind, but then you're also supposed to keep up with the adequate yearly progress. So once a school got behind, virtually impossible to ever get back on track. And you would have this school report card that would show that your school is failing at AYP, and then certain interventions would come into place and those kinds of things. But the issues weren't just that AYP was an issue. Each state was able to choose its high stakes test that they were using to show AYP. And so you couldn't necessarily compare at the time I was living in Illinois, like what Illinois was doing versus what Missouri was doing might have been kind of the same, but not every state was using the same test. And so there was a lot of like incontinuity with how to measure differences between different states. And then the second part with that was an issue was that it took away from the curriculum that was supposed to be taught, and teachers started teaching to the test because in some cases their jobs were at stake if their students weren't showing AYP. And so a lot of time was spent just teaching to the test, which is never a good thing. Okay, so in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act replaced No Child Left Behind. And its primary objective, you can see here, improve opportunities for all children to receive a fair, equitable, and high quality education and to close achievement gaps. Did it do that? I think the jury is still out on that, but it did allow states to have a little bit more autonomy over the policies. And so it was a step in the right direction. Some legislation related to special education reform. I'm sure you guys have studied this before, but Public Law 94-142, that's mainstreaming, least restrictive environment were two of the big highlights of that. It certainly did way more than that, but just to highlight a couple things. IDEA, IDEIA, differences between regular education and SPED programming. They try to kind of, I don't know, make that a little bit more so that students were getting closer to the same kinds of um, experiences when it came to school. And certainly, this is sort of an ongoing issue. Probably all of you, even if you're not going to be doing special education, will be working with students who have differing abilities and differing needs. You've probably heard of Common Core state standards. These are entirely voluntary. Some states have adopted them, some do not. But this addresses like English language arts, math, and gives some benchmarks of where students should be. And then you may have heard of also about the Race to the Top, also RTT. It's also voluntary. But what it did is it provided grant money, seed money for schools, districts that teachers who had some creative ways to help drive curricula and teaching methods and things like that. Basically meant to like spur some creative thinking. Other trends. So we use computers a lot to do testing, especially here in college. And when you do your content exam, it'll be the same way. It'll be on a computer. But what is specifically talking about is things like the NCLEX in nursing. So when a student answers a question, if they answer the question successfully, they go on to the next question. If they don't answer the question successfully, then it'll backtrack and give them something that is like the same difficulty. And it's meant to see like what level the students really like progress is at. So that's interesting, and AI is only going to continue to feed into that, the ability to do that. Um, in the US, students are in the top 25% when ranked around the world for math and science, so the top quarter, but significantly behind most Asian countries. Depending on the measure, Russian students and then other European students can also be ranked above the US in terms of math and science scores. Most always, probably in every state, I'm not sure, but certainly here in Missouri, there is a minimum standard for licensure. And DESE sets those cut scores. You have to pass the content exams. You have to do certain classes, and then you can apply for your teaching certificate. And here at Truman, Mrs. Hatfield is the one who helps us through that process. So, like the Praxis or National Board Certified Teaching, which is something you might want to do once you're established and you're kind of that's sort of the gold standard when it comes to teaching. And then one more trend, value added models. And this is something that is popular in some states and in some districts, but teachers are evaluated based on their students' progress. And so that can be really great. If you have a lot of high achieving students and they're doing very well, then your personal teaching evaluation would be very high. But if you have students who are struggling, it would affect your teaching evaluation in a negative way. Now, here's the thing, like, this isn't always a really great way to look at things because if you read through the book, it'll tell you more details. But the research shows that teachers only influence 14% of a student's score, that there's a lot of other things that affect the student's score. How much sleep they got the night before? Did they have breakfast? Are they worried about other things? How much did they prepare at home? Do they feel safe in the environment? All of those external factors are more linked. That's the other, 86% that make up what a student gets in terms of a grade on a test or assessment. Okay, moving on to chapter 3. This is a graphic about the whole child. And this is something that I think resonates extremely well, given that my background is physical education and health. We talk a lot about holistic wellness, and holistic wellness being like physical wellness, emotional wellness, social wellness, psychological wellness, and so on and so on. And all of the factors are interrelated and interconnected, and every single one of them affects the other parts. So it's the same exact concept. So the academics, the behavior, the social emotional maturity, it all comes together. And that's what you see in the middle, where it's this whole child in this Venn diagram, the middle part, all affects how a student does and how successful they are in a school setting. Every single part of this is necessary for success. So if you have a student who just knows the information, but they have a hard time coping with, making friends, or maybe a hard time coping with emotions or loss of control, if they have a hard time governing, like creating responsible behaviors, that's going to affect their academics. Okay. Now, there's a lot of opposition when it comes to the concepts around the whole child because different groups feel that this is maybe outside the scope of what should be taught in classroom settings, that part of this is or should be on parents to manage when it comes to like the social emotional growth and the behavior. But a lot of times all falls onto the teacher's plate. And I think you will find varying levels of success when you're in your classrooms and you have to interact with parents. And if you make a phone call home, if a student's having some behavior issues, you may find sort of a mixed bag of how much support you receive from that. Same thing from your principal, same thing from your colleagues, and those kinds of things. All right, let's talk a little bit about multi-tiered systems of support. I'll give you a little graphic here. This is straight from your book, but you can see Um, most students are going to fall into tier one. All right. This is 80 to 85% of students. And that means that they get the same lesson, taught the same way. They're in a traditional classroom setting. They're doing the same work as their peers, and they're expected to perform to the same like grade level standards. Okay. This is the bulk of the students who you will be teaching. In tier two, that's about 10 to 15% of students. These are students who need a little bit more help. They may need extra time on a test. They may need to be pulled out and have like some intentional reading time off on the side. They may need some therapy, but they're going to be in smaller groups so they get more intensive help and or pulled out for specific types of help. Tier three, this is the smallest amount of students, but sometimes these are the students who also require the most effort on your part as a teacher. And these are people who need intensive remediation. And a lot of times, these students will not be mainstreamed, so to speak. They may join their peers, maybe for like physical education, art, or music, but they spend the rest of the day doing something with a that's more like one-on-one. There's some really great examples in table 3.1 if you get a chance to look at those. Okay, so next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about RTI. And if you're like, I have no idea what that is, response to intervention. And as a general rule, teachers do not enjoy paperwork. I think the easiest part of my job is teaching. The part of my job that I dislike the most is all of the things that stem out of that, the emails, um, and the paperwork that goes along with being able to just get in the classroom and teach. So here's a little bit of background. This is an example of the multi-tiered um, model that we just talked about. It's a tiered system, right? Where you have assessment, instruction, and then there's database decision making. All sounds great, right? And it's for students in both regular and SPED classrooms. This was mandated by federal law in 2006, but it's been implemented in different ways in different states, so it's not uniform. If you were to, leave Missouri and go teach in somewhere like Colorado or California, it might be entirely different, right? And you can see that this kind of mirrors the same model that we had on the last slide. So the bulk of students get regular instruction in a traditional classroom setting, right? Second tier, 15% about of students, they need a little bit of extra intervention. So they might need some extra reading help, or they might need some extra math help. And they go into this tier and they get this extra help with the hope that they will get back on pace with their peers and move back to tier one. If being in tier two identifies more issues that require more intensive intervention, then they will move to tier three, right? And tier three is those students who need more comprehensive services. So maybe they need some speech therapy, occupational therapy, maybe they need access to some special education resources. Okay, but the idea is that students are moving toward tier one as much as possible. So the benefits. When we use systems like this, there's early intervention because there's screening and things like that. So it helps identify students who are at risk, and then puts resources in place that help with those whatever issues have been identified. So they're getting early intervention. It also allows for collaborative help, sort of a synergy between regular and SPED resources. And it typically means that students have more success. So it uses a process that is more formative. So along the way, testing along the way, rather than just one big test at the end, like summative assessments. Because when we're using more formative assessment, it allows us to sort of see what's happening in lifetime. And then it makes for quicker sort of revisions and adjustments as needed in lifetime rather than waiting till the end of a quarter or end of a semester to get help and have sort of a check-in. Okay, so different approaches. There is the standard protocol approach. So delivery of one intervention strategy. So if, a student is in tier two, maybe they get a little bit of extra time, hold off to the side in a special reading group. There's very specific guidelines and procedures, has high fidelity, meaning that students have a lot of success in what they're being helped with. Okay, but it's sort of a one size fits all approach. And in a large school that doesn't have a lot of resources, this is probably going to be the protocol that's used because there just won't be enough resources to be able to be more individualized. Another approach is called the problem-solving approach, and there's a team that identifies issues, implements appropriate interventions, evaluate progress. Picture this being like an IEP team, and this allows for more individualized interventions. Okay. But there's typically lower integrity and fidelity in these groups because there's a team of people, and working together sometimes can be good, sometimes not. You can check out table 3.2 for some different comparisons between these two. Okay, we're at the halfway point. We're going to hit these last three chapters real quick, and then this video will be over. Okay, so let's talk about decision making and teaching. Your decisions every single day um, can be second guessed, not just by you, but by your principal, by the students, by your teaching colleagues. And a lot of times you're going to be asked to justify why you're choosing to do and then fill in the blank. Okay. So to be successful, you're going to have to report test and assessment data to your stakeholders. Right. And that's nothing that you probably don't already know. Like you're going to give tests and you're going to report that assessment data. But it's the interpreting test data that sometimes is the harder part, but maybe most important part of this whole entire picture. So not only do we give the test, do we get a grade, can we compare it against tiers, but like what does that mean? What does that mean for the specific student? What does that mean for the curriculum? What does that mean for my teaching methods? All of those kinds of things. Okay. So here's some examples. Oh, I put this graphic on. This is one of my absolute favorite memes. Um, this is something in higher ed, students asking for extra credit toward the end of the semester. Just makes me absolutely crazy. So that's just a little pet peeve. Now you know. Um, some different decisions that you will make as a classroom teacher. And when I say classroom teacher, this is everything. So even like for my physical educators who are going to be in the gym, we're considering that your classroom. You've got your nuts and bolts choices. These are things that are made by all teachers. What time does the lesson start? What time does the lesson end? Um, do I have something I'm going to hand out today? Do I need to make printouts of this? Do I need to put something on the board? Do I need to get supplies? What do I do if a student misbehaves? What do I do if the groups that I'm going to put students in, if I have some students who are sick, or if I had a student who was sick yesterday who needs to make things up? These are the nuts and bolts decisions that you make on a daily basis. Okay. Um, I gave you an example here. So if your students are struggling with a certain math concept, you're not going to be like, well, sorry, we're out of time. Time to move to the next thing. You're probably going to like take a little bit of time out of the next thing or say, okay, we're going to pick back up with this later, but you're not going to just um, acknowledge that they're struggling and then just continue to move forward. Okay, so those are instructional decisions. Grading and marking decisions. We make decisions about student grades all the time. So, when I set up a syllabus, I'm trying to figure out how many quizzes we're going to have. In this case, we've got discussion boards, we've got quizzes. You're getting grades based on the videos that you create, all kinds of things like that. And they're all things that I think are important. Okay, so nobody's telling me that I have to do those certain things, but knowing what I know from my education, like I think those are all good things. So I'm deciding what assessments help form the grade. Other factors that can be part of this are attendance, um, participation, attitude, behavior, and effort. Now, that last part, as part of the affective domain, is really difficult to measure and really difficult to justify as part of a grade. So you have to be very careful to know exactly what what sort of your rubric is in terms of those grades, because if you get asked like what constitutes like my attitude, like being like I'm getting a plus or a minus for today, you have to have something objective. Diagnostic decisions. So we're going to look at student strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to use objective test data, but also our subjective judgment to determine if a student needs more intervention. Okay. So in this case, it's like if you're not passing a student, is there enough information to hold that student back and give them a failing grade in a class? So there are also educational decisions made outside the classroom, and these are made by specialist administrators, different committees. So I gave you a couple examples here. These are the ones that the book talks about. Selection decisions, and for you guys, like with ACT, you didn't have to do GRE for grad school, but some grad schools require that. Your college admission to Truman, there's a committee of people who make those decisions, and it's based on a lot of different things. It's not just an ACT score. Um, so placement decisions. So I give you an example here, testing into Spanish 2. When you came to Truman, you all had to do language placement, math placement, and that helps determine what class you're going to start at. Counseling and guidance decisions. This is when you sit down with somebody and talk about your future career or vocation, and somebody to kind of give you a little bit of back, like, here's what you're going to need to do. Here's the types of classes you'll need to take. Here are the skills that you'll need to do. Does this match with what you're excited about, what your passions are? Program and curriculum decisions. Usually these are made at the district level. I gave you an example here. So if your district decides that they're going to change the math textbook, it will be vetted out, for a period of time where parents can come and look at that. They can have some input at a school board meeting, but usually there's a committee of people who will determine that, like, we're going to move from this math book to that math book. And then there's administrative policy decisions. So what I gave you a couple examples here. If we're, passing somebody from 8th grade to 9th grade, what constitutes graduation requirements? How do we decide how much budget you get? How you can spend that budget? Those kinds of things are all administrative policy decisions. So the decisions in the classroom are only a part or snapshot of the decisions that affect teachers on a daily basis. So the chapter takes a little bit of an abrupt turn from there, and we're going to talk a little bit about measurement. So consider this to be sort of a stop, and then a start. Okay. So problems with measurement. Number one, defining what you want to measure. And number two, determining how to measure whatever it is that you want to measure. So once you decide what the right thing to measure is, you have to decide what the right measurement tool is. So I give you an example here. You have a teacher who wants to test math ability in an intro high school math class. All right, this example's in the book. You can read about it. She creates a set of elaborate word problems that focus on applying math concepts to real life situations. So like story problems. Here's the issue. Is she measuring math skills? Is she measuring the student's ability to read? Is it a combination of like reading, doing the math, and then applying it to the context? So in a lot of cases, these can be really like that kind of way of doing things might not be the best way to measure what we're intending to measure. Now, can it be a part of how we measure what we're intending to measure? Yes. But if you have students, especially who are who struggle with reading, it may not be that they don't know how to do the math problem. It may be that they don't understand the question. So thinking through, is there a better way to measure those math skills? All right. We'll talk about that more. You're going to be creating test items and things, but just to start your thinking. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about norm and criterion reference test, a little bit about validity as well. So on the top end here, general purpose of testing is to gather information that help us make decisions, informed decisions. And those decisions can help us place or rank a student compared to a norm that's norm referenced, or they can help us provide information when we compare a student against a standard. And that's where you have these norm reference and criterion reference. We kind of talked about those in the earlier chapter. So back to this, kind of a comparison of the two. With the norm reference test, 50% of the students get an item correct. With criterion referenced, maybe the benchmark is that 80% of students get an item correct. There's a lot of objectives on the norm reference side. Usually the criterion reference only has a few objectives to be met. Norm reference is going to compare performance to peers. Criterion referenced is standard based, so it's to a preset standard. Usually the norm referenced is a percentile rank, so you'd be like 99% in the 99th percentile or something like that. Criterion reference usually is a range, an acceptable range. And then on the norm reference side, it's useful if the student tested fits the typical student profile or demographic. Criterion reference might be more appropriate for diverse populations because the norm reference tests, when you're comparing performance to peers, if the student isn't like their peers, it's really hard to make a valid comparison. So that gets us to different things related to measurement. Okay, we want high content validity, meaning that we are measuring the content that we're looking at, that is measuring and aligning with the objectives of what we want students to know. So this little asterisk over here, content validity is high when test responses align with what the objectives require. So I'm sure you've all been in class where you get to test day and there's some questions on the test and you're like, we never talked about this. That's a problem. That would be very low content validity. Okay. Ideally, the test is going to mirror what the students have been learning about in class. Okay. So they match up with the objectives. So in stage one, we're looking at instructional objectives, and then we're going to create instructional activities to teach those objectives, to drive those objectives. And then in stage three, we're going to provide a test that measures whether or not the student understands and is able to meet those instructional objectives. Okay. So when it comes to these kinds of things, that means that we have to have good goal and objective statements. So goals are usually very broad statements, general outcomes. A lot of times they're lumped in with like vision statements and things like that. So we have a vision in our ES department, and it is to hit 225 students in our major by 2027. And so right now we're already over that mark. So this is a 5-year plan. And so that is our big general goal. From that, we have some program objectives, like how do we help drive student recruitment and retention? Well, on the retention side, we need to do a good job advising. We need to do a good job with creating classes that are meaningful to students and things like that. There are specific objectives when it comes to recruitment and things like that. But our program objectives are a lot more specific than that big general goal that I just told you. Okay. The instructional objectives, these are the student will be able to statements. So by the end of the lesson, the student will be able to, and it's very specific. Okay. Some of this is influenced by the stakeholders. Okay. So the stakeholders also have a say in the curriculum, right? We talked about all the different stakeholders, but this is the smallest bit of the curriculum. So we start with objectives, and then we're going to create activities to drive those objectives. And then we're going to assess whether or not we're meeting those objectives. Okay. And those specific measurable objectives help increase efficiency and effectiveness in teaching and learning. And you can see here, we have the needs and wants of society. So they talk to the school board talks to the superintendent, they collaborate with the admin at the school, who would be like the principal, department heads, whatever, and then it flows back to the teachers. And the same thing when it comes down to from broad to very specific. By the time it gets to you as the teacher, things are very specific. Okay, we'll have more on that in a later chapter. All right, chapter 6, last one, hang in there. How do we assess learning outcomes? So first thing we have to do, if we're starting with learning objectives, is we have to write good objectives. And I tried to color code this for you to make things a little bit easier. And I gave you 2 examples from my world, which is physical education, health education, and of what an objective should look like. So the first part is an observable behavior. It's almost 100% of the time an action verb, something very specific that is supposed to happen, a very specific product or result that we want to see. And then the blue, the second part of this is the special conditions under which the behavior must be displayed. Usually it's a time, a place with certain equipment. It could be a certain score, whatever. Okay. And then the performance level, that's usually actually the score that we want to be considered sufficient to demonstrate mastery. So how well the behavior is to be performed, number of items correct within a specific time, certain degree of accuracy. So I give you a couple examples. Student will be able to swim freestyle for 100 yards in less than 60 seconds. Okay, so you can see the observable behavior is the freestyle stroke in swimming. Special conditions are the length that we want the student to be able to swim. And then the performance level is 60 seconds or less. Second example, given a human skeleton, the student will be able to identify at least 40 bones correctly. So the observable behavior, we're going to talk about Bloom's taxonomy here in a second. Straight off of Bloom's, they're going to identify the special conditions are the at least 40 bones, and then correctly, so at least 40 correctly is the performance level. So those are just two examples, and I'm sure you have worked on these with your the people in your different disciplines when you're writing lesson plans. If not, you will get lots of practice with this once you get to student teaching. So how do we match test items to the instructional objectives? Well, and why is this important? Well, the instructional objectives, we just talked about how to write good objectives, but then we also need the test to align with that. That's what gets us back to that content validity that we talked about in the previous chapter. So I need to know what my learning outcome is. Does the item that I wrote for my test item align with the learning outcome? What do I want students to know and be able to do? And then the second step is to identify the learning conditions. Does the item align with the learning conditions? So this is those steps. We try to be simple, use the most direct way to measure learning outcomes. So for example, an objective test item, recall the names of the capitals of all 50 states. Okay, and you probably had somewhere in elementary school, or maybe in a history or civics class, where you had to learn state capitals, right? So if that's my objective, the test item might say, list the capitals of Texas, New York, California, and Rhode Island. And then the student's going to fill in the blank. Or it could be just one of those. But that test item aligns with the objective, right? That's what we want in a good test item. And the goal is to measure the achievement, related to those objectives. And the best way to determine mastery is to give the student an opportunity to demonstrate the skill under the same conditions that apply to the instructional objective. So I'm not going to say list, the state capitals of Texas and why it's influential that the state capital of Texas is in a certain city. Okay, so that would be outside the scope of this objective. So let's talk a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. I'm sure you have talked about this before in other classes, but we're going to break this down into a cognitive, affective, and psychomotor taxonomy. And so what we want to do is we want students to be moving toward the higher levels of Bloom's. Okay, so they don't just know something, that's the lowest level, most common, where students are able to be successful. But then they're moving toward comprehension, like I'm understanding. I can apply this to a certain context. I can analyze how this is happening in this context and what that means. Synthesis is taking those ideas, lumping more than one idea together, and then evaluating, like, what does this mean because I know all of these things? We're trying to move students toward the highest level possible. Now, if we're talking about kindergartners, right, this is going to look a little different than what I might expect in a student who's in a senior level English class in high school. Here's another example. This one just has, I put this on here because I thought it was kind of cool with all the different verbs, because I think we tend to use when we're writing lesson plan objectives, we tend to use the same verbs over and over and over, but you can see there's a lot of different ways to be able to state those objectives. And the remembering is the bottom tier. So that's the easiest. That's that knowledge on the bottom. And then as we move toward creating, these are the ones that require the most effort. So a lot of in between. Affective domain has its own taxonomy as well. And it starts with receiving and attending. So being aware of a setting or situation, giving our attention to a certain way that things are happening, being open to the experience. So this is like students being open to like what you want to teach them. And then the second level is students responding. They willingly participate. They're not just there, they're not just taking up oxygen in your classroom, but they're actually participating. They're volunteering to help with things, and they're starting to get it. On the third level is valuing. Okay, so they are motivated to want to do better, and that will come out in their displays of like self-responsibility, and they're going to be committed to learning about something. So this is like, you get a student excited about, let's say learning about the Civil War. So on the receiving end, like at the bottom, they're in the classroom, maybe you have some pictures up, maybe you're talking about it a little bit. With responding, they're doing the homework assignment or the coloring page, or they're listening to the video or whatever. In the valuing part, they're going to start asking you questions about that. Can we talk about this again? Can we watch another video? Can we learn a little bit more? The organizing part, they start to prioritize things. And then in the characterizing piece, they're consistently acting because they have intrinsic motivation. They're going to start, this is when they're going to the library and they're checking out a book to learn more on their own. They'll come to school and say, I watched a video last night about this exact same thing. But they're also monitoring their personal behavior, and they're helping the students around them be better versions of themselves. So not only are they working toward their best version, but they're helping other students succeed. And it's really cool if you get students who are at the top part of this pyramid, because man, it is such a bright light in a classroom where sometimes things are just really hard. Okay, on the psychomotor domain. So this is like the experiential kinds of things. And even if you're teaching, so in physical education, this comes out a lot, but every content area can have some psychomotor objectives. Okay. So if you're doing lab or experiential kinds of things, I cannot think of a content area that couldn't be hands-on physically doing something. And this taxonomy looks like reflex movement, so it's something that's not, it's involuntary. Okay. The basic fundamental movements are locomotor, non-locomotor, um, manipulative patterns. So like it's hopping, skipping, jumping, being able to catch, twist, hit a tennis ball. Perceptual, this is the way that students learn. So a lot of times in physical education, students are very kinesthetic learners, because we like to learn by doing. But some students also learn by seeing, watching, or hearing. The physical activities, those are things like endurance, strength, flexibility, agility. And then you've got your skilled movements, which are like mostly put into sport. So being able to hit, a curveball that's being delivered to the plate, to a batter on a 3-2 count. And then the non-discursive communication is the top apex here. This is nonverbal expressive movement. A lot of times you get this in dance or interpretive skills. So that's what the psychomotor domain looks like. So now you've got sort of a taxonomy for all three domains of learning. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about test blueprints. And if you look at table 6.1 in your book, it'll give you some more information. But you should always have a roadmap before you start writing the test. So as you can imagine, we've talked about this a bunch, you need to have objectives. And so you're going to create a content outline, all the important topics that you know you need to put on the test. Okay. And this shouldn't be so many that the test is going to take a super long time, but it has to fit into the context, of when you can apply the test. Right? Different categories of the cognitive taxonomy that you want to include. So like thinking about what's appropriate given like what you want to know. Decide how many questions you want for each of the topics. So if you have 50 topics, you might have one question per topic. Best practices would be more than one question per topic, because that gives students more than one chance to show success. And then you're going to review your content, your questions, to make sure that the test is balanced. So if I'm giving a test, in this case, over 6 chapters, right? I want a little bit about something from each of the 6 chapters, not, 2/3 of the test on chapter 1 and the other 1/3 of the test on chapters 2 through 6. Should be balanced. Okay. So that is it in a nutshell. I know this is way longer than a typical video will be, but hopefully you've learned some things. The book goes into way more detail on these, and I will be back to give you a couple more chapters later on in the class. Have a good one.